Yeah, that, I mean, I stand by the owner occupancy rule. I think it's real important when we're talking about, I think that's the defining feature between this being a development regulation and being a rezone. And I think when this goes to council, you guys are you're gonna hear that. You're gonna hear testimony and they're gonna say, this is a rezone. Effectively, this is what this is. I don't agree with that. I think this is a development regulation. I think this is a housing form that is currently allowed as an attached ADU within a single family. I think this is an expansion of a development regulation that governs single family uses. That's why I think the owner occupancy requirement is so important, because that's the defining difference between multifamily and, you know, having a rental and having a single family neighborhood. So I know that you guys are prepared, but in your testimony and your presentation to council, that's going to come up, and I hope that we could be defensible in that. And you know, what do you say when I say, Greg, this is a rezone? What do you say?
We say that we are revising the accessory uses that are allowed on a single-family lot. A rezone would be increasing the allowed density or allowing triplexes or changing the minimum lot size for a single-family house. These are accessory uses, accessory to single-family.
Which are already allowed.
Which are already
as an attached
allowed,
use in
right.
every single residential single neighborhood.
And you saw on the map where all the areas where detached are already allowed
Right.
in single-family zones.
Right.
But could it be considered a rezone in those single-family neighborhoods where detached is not necessarily allowed?
How?
And would be? I'm just asking, because that is going to be a question that comes up.
Yeah, no, we don't, as I said, these are accessory to single-family, and the owner has to live on site. So, no, it's not we don't consider it a rezone.
I think it's a false narrative, and it's scary because it's perpetuating in the comment we're seeing, and it's not true. And it was presented in an oral testimony to us at the last meeting, and it's not true. And I think we have to go on the record early. I don't think we should wait for council to talk about this, because we received comment in the written comment from people who clearly were uninformed about what a rezone is. We received comment from people who said, I heard from somebody that you're rezoning all the single-family neighborhoods to multifamily, and that's like a scare tactic, and that's like it's a false narrative, and it's going to misinform people about what this is about. And I wholeheartedly support Garrett's comments, because I was really disappointed to see that narrative put out there by people who I think know better than that. And these are already allowed as attached. So saying you can have an ADU and now we're making it detached, that's not rezoning to a multifamily use. That's still a single. Greg, you said it perfectly. It's just changing where the accessory use that's already permitted sits on the lot. Mm-hmm. And so I just think, maybe I'm passionate about this, but I just feel like it's not fair and it's misinforming the public, and we're already seeing commentary on that. And I know Garrett and I have spoken because he received an individual who confronted him face-to-face about it, who was misinformed about that. And I just think it's really important. And so I would recommend, this is just my personal opinion, but I would recommend that when that comes up at our public hearing, at the council level, that we need to be really clear about what we're doing. Mm-hmm. I don't think it's fair to the dialogue that we're having. And it takes us away from what we're really talking about.
The gentleman that Ali referenced, when we had the discussion about whether it's a rezone or whether it's an expansion of already approved accessory uses, when I told him that the owner-occupied provision was going to be maintained in force, that alleviated significant concern. And I think that's appropriate, and I think that's an appropriate concern. But, you know, because people don't always read the draft, you know, documents, or they don't know the full details of the existing ordinance, there's misconception, and
yeah.
and the narrative gets out there that something's happening with single-family neighborhoods, and so I think it is, when we have our public hearing and we're going to take testimony, we're going to hear a lot of that, and I certainly would appreciate it if, you know, our planning professionals are defensible in that position, because you're in the right. This is a correct application of land use regulations.
I would like, and I agree, but I'd like to address the tone. I don't think necessarily defensible, but I think it's a good educational opportunity. I'm not a professional. I don't work in the profession. I don't have 20 years behind me. I've been a couch planning, junkie for 15 years and involved in my neighborhood with neighborhood plan updates. And, I've got a litany of, I got pages of terminology that when I first started, you guys were like winging words back and forth and acronyms, and I'm writing everything down and going back and looking up, making sure that I understood what it was. And, my first couple of months, half the time I wasn't aware what something was. So I've been educating myself, and I don't think necessarily the public is, I think people passionately believe that this is a rezone, and that they think of multifamily because you're looking at a single-family lot that may, not new development, but current, residence where you have one house, and now you're putting two houses. And so to them, that seems like it's multifamily because you have multifamilies living on a single-family lot. And that's the brain process of understanding the terminology and how it applies to what they see happening. So, it would be useful, and it'd be useful for me to understand the standards and practices and the rules and the law in the sense of how terminology is applied and how it's governed through making these changes. So when people see things, they know that you're changing. And then there's concern of the effect. And I do believe that owner occupancy is the linchpin on whether or not any of this goes forward successfully and more palatable to a lot of people who have a lot of concerns.
Sure.
But I think when it comes time, use it as an educational opportunity as part of the introduction to help define the difference between what it is you're trying to accomplish and what an actual rezone is. Because I hear from people that you guys haven't gone through the proper process, because when you look at a rezone, first you have all the neighborhood meetings, you have information that goes out from the city to notify the residents of a change. They have the opportunity to meet before this information comes before us. And that process wasn't done, and so people feel like the process for a rezone hasn't been followed. And I don't think they're trying to use it as a way to spread misinformation. It's what they understand because they're not professionals and have all these years of experience. So I think it's going to be, I would appreciate that information and a clearer definition and how this applies to it and why it is not a rezone, but not necessarily in your technical language, because I don't want to go get a master's degree in planning, but something that a lay person is going to be able to understand and apply it. I think that would be useful.
Thanks, Lisa. I agree. I think having an explanation would be really helpful. Appreciate those comments. I don't know if I agree completely, though. I think a lot of the people that are making those comments know a lot about what we're doing, and they're people who participate actively and are aware of what we're doing. And I think when you tell people it's a rezone, I'm worried about the people that you're talking about who don't know, the lay people. And when they're told by people they trust that something is something, they believe it without looking into it. And, I'm not going to, I guess I shouldn't try and assume what people are trying to accomplish, but I just think that is not a narrative that needs to be out there. And people should, maybe it's just as simple as explaining to people that you can have an attached ADU now. So we're not talking about adding a house to a lot that has one house. You can already do that. They just happen to be attached, and now they're detached. And there's a big difference.
Well,
but I think that the owner occupancy is a linchpin, because if you take that away, then you are creating two units on a lot. That's the difference. If you don't have an owner occupancy, it's an apartment. It's just a 2-unit detached apartment.
If you look at some of the written comments, the people are questioning.
Thank you. Yeah.
People are questioning, why we're removing the owner occupancy requirement. So there's all kinds of misinformation floating around out there.
And that's a
anything
key
we can
issue.
do to clear that up, we are happy to do.
Anything? I know you have thoughts on owner occupancy. I'm very curious.
I'm not sold on it, but I think there's some things that we should consider. More than half of Bellingham homes are renters. Renters deserve to live in single-family neighborhoods also. We have a shortage, a serious shortage of housing, and a competition for low and middle rent places. A lot of neighborhoods are converted, seem to be, kind of have that conversion, especially on the edge of like the Leonard Streets neighborhood. I live in a duplex that was a single-family house that was turned into a duplex, and there's at least 4 of them on our block. And it creates a home for 2 couples in one single-family home. It's a really efficient use of space. We're able to share the yard costs and share taking care of our space. And I think our street looks like just like any other Leonard Streets neighborhood. And we're able to do so at a cost that's affordable. So I understand that it's a linchpin. I also think that the polarizing voices that are so against removing the owner occupancy are not necessarily a majority. And if we broaden the conversation and educated people about what we mean by owner occupancy, I do think it would be less polarizing. That being said, I was looking at an interesting survey of Seattle residents, and it certainly is polarizing. 1/3 of people were strongly in favor of removing owner occupancy, and 2/3 were strongly against it. And it was like kind of the one issue where there was literally no one that didn't feel strongly about it. And so, while I'm certainly not, I'm not in favor of removing it, I don't think that it's as polarizing as we think, and I think that it's something that we shouldn't say we're removing or that we're keeping owner occupancy, and the next time we look at this, we should certainly keep it again, because places like Vancouver have gotten rid of owner occupancy requirements, and it was one of the regulations that they cite as being one that was very arduous and one of the reasons that there's been such an increase in DADU building.
And then, that's a good comment, and it begs the question of like, we went there, would this become a rezone and go through an entirely different legislative process?
No, I don't think so, but we would have the concern about developers buying up places. I think that's the major concern.
That's the flip side.
We have, that's a interesting discussion. I'm not fearful of most development patterns. I think people generally, with the right guidance, try to do well. The owner occupancy is really important to me. To me, that's the difference between, more of a rezone and what a development regulation is. Because, we have mandates in our growth management that require us to preserve single-family neighborhoods. And now the housing options and forms can change within those neighborhoods, but that is an important part of the fabric of our community. So, but I wouldn't be opposed to, if we had a threshold limit of, say, 1%, 2%, that gets looked at, because things change. And whereas that is really important right now, to me at least, in 15, 20 years, as other needs have higher, priorities, that might not be. So it might be something that we think about revisiting. If we do put a threshold into the draft ordinance, that is something that's targeted to look at.
So ADUs is a term that kind of is pretty new in planning speak. Washington, that first came around in the early 90s, 93, when the state, because of housing prices and pressure, kind of mandated all communities to look at that, and some went with the draft language, and others went more aggressive. A lot of other cities started with detached and single-family neighborhoods from the get-go, and those cities are now looking at removing owner occupancy. We started more conservatively and are now taking this step. So I think what Garrett's saying maybe is interesting. The area where, so there's all these pre-existing non-conforming use outbuilding dwellings. So they're not necessarily ADUs. They existed way before we called them ADUs. A lot of them have not been brought into compliance. And that's one of the big issues, one of the big criticisms, and a lot of the feedback we hear is, why aren't we counting the non-conforming pre-existing ones? And I imagine one of the big barriers to bringing them into compliance is they're probably not owner-occupied. And so a lot of the hating on ADUs we get in our comments is not about the newly constructed ones. I mean, staff said last time, the newly constructed permanent ones do not have compliance complaints or in general issues. The police survey you mentioned, it's those pre-existing, predating the 90s. And it doesn't sound like there's been a lot of construction of unpermitted ADUs since the 90s either. So if one of our goals, if you clamped down immediately and removed all those outbuildings from the housing stock, the pre-existing unpermitted illegal ADUs from the housing stock, you'd have 500 people out on the streets, and that would have a huge ripple effect through the rental market. You would create instant homelessness. Some of those people would not be able to find homes. And no one's calling for that. But if there's some sort of way to do a rolling program to bring those into compliance, that's in everyone's best interest. But they're not going to come into compliance if they're not owner-occupied. And so there's kind of a tension there that is unresolvable with the way the rules are now, and we're going to continue with.
One solution that Garrett, you brought up, I think years ago when we first started, was maybe a baby step would be looking at the multifamily zones. I think the area you live in is actually zoned multifamily, and so we see that a lot where you have a house in a single-family neighborhood that's got multifamily zoning and it's turned into a duplex. I mean, I think you brought this up years ago, the idea of like, why do we have an owner occupancy restriction in a multifamily neighborhood when you could build a duplex and have two families living next to each other? But if you want to build an ADU behind your house, one of them has to be owner occupied. That doesn't make sense. I don't think that makes sense. So maybe something to consider is as a step in that direction would be looking at removing that requirement in a multifamily zone only.
Yeah, well, one thing is when you're talking about densities, because there are single-family homes and multifamily neighborhoods that don't have the required density to do a duplex.
Yeah.
Say if you have a 5,000 square foot lot and you need 3,500 per unit, so you need 7,000 to do a duplex, but you only have 5,000 square feet. That's where that begs the question. Is it appropriate to allow more density? Or is that's not a accessory use, that's a intensifying the density. So that is a zoning, concern there. So, but should owner occupied requirements in multifamily zone? Probably not. It's probably not appropriate. That's not, the idea behind our land zoning designations is to get the highest and best use out of those zoned areas. And that is prohibitive. I mean, clearly, if there's density in a multifamily, you should be able to have an ADU. That would disincentivize people to do a tear down and build a duplex, right? That would give you options. And
Yeah.
that certainly, if that's not part of this code, that certainly should be a qualifier if you have the density.
Lisa?
Gentlemen, help me out with this. I'm having such a deja vu of this conversation and agreeing with you that in a multifamily, owner occupancy is not as critical. And we talked about ADUs. Did we address this in the comp plan?
I think we talked about it. I think that's when Garrett brought it up.
But it
was
didn't,
never addressed.
because we had a conversation on this, and I remember talking about that and agreeing that, it is a multifamily because your example of tearing down an old house that could be basically turned into a duplex, keep the old house because that's really more efficient and environmental. And it doesn't necessarily have to be, because a duplex wouldn't have to be owner occupant.
Right.
Right.
So why would a ADU situation in a multi-family have to be owner occupied? That doesn't make any sense to me either.
It's a good point. Let us check the exact language in the comp plan. I think what it says, policy statements, if I remember right, is to require owner occupancy in single-family zones.
Yeah.
I think is what the policy
Yeah,
says.
can you look, we can circle back to this issue.
Yeah.
It's a lot of good discussion on it.
We should allow I mean, that's a perfect opportunity as we're rewriting this ordinance to take those multifamily zoned areas and allow that flexibility. That's gonna, I can see that, that's not just a hypothetical, the preservation of housing stock. You're gonna be able to get a higher unit yield on a multifamily property, and you don't have to do a demolition of an existing structure, and there may be value to that existing structure. So that,
And you don't have to confront the issue Lisa raises, which is scary for people, which is, you know, I've got one house with a guest house, and now I've got two houses by different people, the
Right.
single-family component. It gives us a slow lead into that. Lisa?
And I'm just going to go on a limb and go wild here and probably shock you guys with this, but in a multifamily, providing you're maintaining that 30% green space, what's to prevent a situation of rehabbing an old house into two dwelling units and building a detached ADU and not having owner occupancy as a requirement?
If it had the
Only-
density, right?
Pardon?
If it had the density for 2 units.
Correct.
Yeah.
Or possibly
now we're talking.
3, because you
Okay.
have, you have a large house, upstairs, downstairs, you've converted it into like a 2-apartment dwelling, but then you build the detached ADU, providing you're meeting the other criteria for green space and everything else, because again, if we're not tearing down that old house, I mean, I know somebody who recently converted old house from a duplex back into an old house for their family. So, but they were thankful that this beautiful old house was still available,
Right.
and they were able to do that conversion. And I'd rather see the preservation of these old houses, but also the opportunity to create more housing stock and density in a multifamily area.
Good point.
And I think all the comments we've received to date would probably be compatible with that
Yeah,
idea.
Yeah.
I think so.
The question is density, so Chris, you guys can look at that, because the infill toolkit allowed for, these different housing forms in multifamily. It still had the owner occupancy provision, which it, probably shouldn't, but it still required density, right? It still
No,
required density.
in the infill toolkit, you don't have to,
don't have
it
to
doesn't
have
count as a
density,
density.
yeah.
It's what Lisa said.
Yeah.
If you have a density for 2 units in the infill toolkit in a multifamily, you can build a duplex and you can have an ADU, but you have an owner occupancy requirement.
Right.
So it's something to talk about more.
You can do one or the other. You can't build a duplex and then on that duplex property,
Right.
sorry. You can't build a duplex and add an ADU to that. What you could do is you could build a duplex on a 6,000 square foot lot, or you could build a single family home with an ADU.
Oh, okay.
You can't, an ADU can only occur in conjunction with
You have the
a
density.
single family home.
Cottage, those kind of ones. The small house, smaller house.
Yes.
Gotcha. Well, interesting. That's an interesting point. So let's talk parking real quick, and then we can maybe wrap up.
9 minutes, go.
We still have Happy Valley proposals to go through.
Well,
So
I
there's,
don't,
there's,
do
there's
we?
5 there. That's
mean,
attachment 2A.
Because we're not proposing that.
We're not proposing.
I don't think we're proposing that we do Happy Valley.
No, well, it would be an amendment, it would be code amendments that you would be providing recommendations on as a pilot program to move forward and planning to city council.
I guess, Chris, what all he's saying is we're past that. If we're recommending that this gets implemented citywide, this is incorporating detached ADUs in single-family zones, which is the kind of bulk of the Happy Valley pilot program. That's the main difference.
I do see the value of addressing it separately, because they've put a lot of effort into it. And if it's not supported at the city council level to allow detached ADUs in single-family neighborhood, there goes Happy Valley's project. And so if we do keep it separate,
Or at least
it is.
there goes our commentary on it.
Well, right, but I mean, I'm just thinking that I think there's value in keeping separate consideration, because there's not a guarantee one would be approved, but maybe there's more likely the other would. And so I would just hate to miss that opportunity after all the work that they've put forward.
It's a good point.
Yeah, I would agree. They did put a lot of work into it, and maybe after you go through it, at the end, you decide, well, we should just use the citywide rules anyway, but at least we should spend the time to go through
Fair
it. And
enough.
what I would suggest is that we not do that when we're We've been at this for 3 hours. At the next, let's see, we don't have any items 11.2, but 11.16, we're going to start talking about the commercial code revisions. We could take the first half an hour of that meeting, hammer out these last few items,
Lisa, you're
and still go
correct.
ahead with the public hearing on the 7th.
I agree, actually, now hearing your thought process. We would be abdicating our participation if the citywide proposal failed. You make a very good point. But I think Greg makes another good point. Well, no, it's 10, and we should just do this at the next meeting if we have another meeting before our public hearing. I don't think it will take us, that commercial code won't take a 3-hour meeting maybe, and we could give some time to,
And everything in the Happy Valley is stuff there's stuff
Not
we've
that
talked
different.
about. There's just different parameters,
Yeah.
different numbers.
Can we finish up though with the parking